It was around midnight when I stepped into the hospital's forensic pathology department, the place where the dead spoke their final, silent words through the work I did. The fluorescent lights above flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the cold, sterile room. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of the computers and the rustle of papers. I had my usual night shift ahead of me, Jess. Another routine, another set of reports to finish. I was used to the isolation here. Most people found the autopsy room eerie, unsettling, but I didn't. It was just part of the job. After years of doing this, the bodies felt distant, just things to be processed. It wasn't my first time being alone with the dead, and I'd convinced myself it wouldn't be the last. But that night was different. I was moving between the tables, checking the bodies, when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the ringing in my ears, a side effect of being awake too long. But then the sound grew clearer, almost like someone whispering. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. A soft voice, weak but distinct, seemed to come from the table right in front of me. I'm here, I'm here. I blinked, trying to process it. The voice was so clear, so real, but it didn't make sense. This wasn't something I normally experienced, and for a second, I thought I was imagining it. But when I looked at the body, when my eyes moved to the head, the corpse's mouth had opened slightly. It looked as if the body was trying to speak, to say something. Fear and curiosity stirred inside me. I didn't know what to think. The body, no, the corpse, wasn't supposed to be doing this. And yet, there it was, its mouth moving, as if it was still trying to hold onto life, even in death. I had to get a grip on myself. I wasn't going to be spooked over something like this. I tried to shake off the unease, but my hands were shaking, and the coldness in the room felt even more oppressive. I took a tentative step closer. The body's head had turned slightly to the right, and its mouth was still open, just slightly ajar. It felt like something was alive in that room with me, something that shouldn't be. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. My mind was racing. I had work to finish, but how could I ignore this? Maybe it was nothing, a trick of the light. Maybe it was just my imagination getting the best of me. But there was something in that room, something that didn't belong. After a few moments, I returned to the computer, trying to focus on the reports. The normalcy of the paperwork should have been a comfort, but it wasn't. It felt wrong, like I was avoiding something I wasn't supposed to ignore. My mind kept drifting back to that whisper. The voice had felt too real, too insistent. The morning came, and I continued my work. I reviewed the autopsy reports, expecting everything to be routine, but something caught my eye. The report for the body I'd examined was marked with time of death, undetermined. That didn't make sense. There was always a clear time of death, something to anchor the report, something definitive. But this one was different. And then there was the mouth. It had been closed when I first checked the body, but now it appeared to have opened during the autopsy. I stared at the screen, feeling a pit form in my stomach. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a mistake. I tried to ignore the gnawing sense of dread growing inside me. Maybe it was the exhaustion talking, the long hours getting to my head. But something followed me. Something had changed that night. I felt it every time I walked through the door, every time I sat at the table. That night, when I returned for my shift, the room felt different. The air was heavier, thicker. The shadows in the corners seemed to move with a mind of their own. The lights above buzzed, as if struggling to stay on. And then the whispers came again. I'm here. You must find me. It was the same voice, but it was clearer, no more distinct. And it wasn't just the voice that unnerved me. There was a sob in the whisper, a despair that made my skin crawl. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned toward the body again. It felt like the air around me was closing in, suffocating me. When I got closer to the table, everything stopped. The room fell into a suffocating silence. The body's mouth opened again, and the voice echoed through the stillness. "I need to talk to you." This time the voice was muffled, deeper, and it seemed to carry an urgency that I couldn't ignore. I don't know why, but I reached out, instinctively moving to close the body's mouth. But as I did, something inside me snapped. Suddenly, the body jerked. I recoiled in shock, my heart pounding in my chest. The body's muscles twitched as if they were waking from a long slumber. I stumbled backward, my mind racing for a way out. The body's mouth opened wide again, and this time the voice was sharper, more demanding than before. "You must come with me. I'm still here because you didn't want me to leave." The room went dark, and in that instant, I felt a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I bolted from the room, my mind scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. But when I looked back, everything had changed. The body was gone. The room was empty. The reports, the files, everything was gone. But the whispers didn't stop. Every night since, that voice has followed me. It echoes in my ears, creeping into my thoughts when I'm alone. I'm still here. I'm still here. I can't escape it. And now, I'm not so sure I want to. Death isn't just an end, I've learned. It's a beginning. A beginning of something I don't understand. It was close to midnight, and the hospital was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the distant murmurs of a few nurses working in the emergency and intensive care units. Their figures barely visible in the weak flicker of the lights. I was on call that night, as I had been many times before. I moved through the empty hallways, checking on the cases, the routine almost comforting in its monotony. Everything felt normal, at least until my call panel suddenly began to ring. Building 5, room 304. The number on the screen stopped me in my tracks. Room 304. I couldn't believe it. That room had been out of service for years. In fact, it was in the old, abandoned section of the hospital that had been closed off long ago. No patients had been placed there in ages. Everyone knew that part of the building was empty and unused. So, an emergency call from this room was not only strange, it was almost impossible. I stared at the screen, trying to wrap my mind around it. I thought I was hearing things. But there it was again. A few more words popped up. Help. It felt wrong, unnatural. The chill running through my spine was immediate. But as fear and curiosity crept in, I found myself moving toward the abandoned section without fully thinking it through. The air felt colder as I made my way down the dimly lit corridors. The lights flickered above, threatening to go out, casting long shadows. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, like time itself had forgotten this part of the hospital. My footsteps echoed, unnervingly loud, as if the very walls were listening. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. The deeper I went, the more it felt like I was walking through a forgotten world. The walls were lined with faded paint, cracked and peeling as if the building itself had given up on ever being used again. Old equipment lay abandoned in corners, and the smell of dust and decay filled the air. Yet the strange thing was that it didn't feel completely empty. There was something lurking in the shadows, just out of sight. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the hospital itself was holding its breath, waiting. When I finally reached room 304, everything seemed off. The door creaked open, and I was greeted by the musty air of a room that hadn't been touched in years. The walls were faded, the old medical equipment discarded and forgotten. Dust floated lazily in the dim light, and it was hard to shake the sense of unease that seemed to cling to the space. But it was the patient in the bed that truly unsettled me. The bed was ancient, worn, but the sheets were pristine. The man lying there barely moved. His skin was deathly pale, and the way his body sagged in the bed made it clear that he was hanging on by a thread. I watched him closely. His chest rose and fell so slowly, it was hard to tell if he was still breathing. His mouth opened slightly, as if he were about to speak. I leaned in, waiting for him to utter something, but there was only silence. His breathing was faint, almost imperceptible, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced down at his records. No name, no history, just an empty spot where a patient's information should be. This made no sense. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Who was this man? As I stood there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, something caught my eye. Across the room, in the corner, there was an old chair. At first, I thought it was just another forgotten piece of hospital furniture, but then I saw it something moving in the shadow of the chair. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. The shadow, it wasn't natural. It was as if something was sitting there, watching me. I turned quickly, trying to dismiss the thought, but the room felt suffocating. Goosebumps prickled across my skin. I could barely breathe as I looked back at the chair, but now it was empty, or so I thought. Then I heard it a whisper, soft at first, then clearer. "Don't leave me." I felt my blood run cold. My body froze. That wasn't the patient. It was coming from somewhere else in the room. My mind raced as I checked the patient's records again, desperate for an explanation. But once again, the room's records were empty. No name, no history, just the room number. That's when everything seemed to crumble. The lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. I could no longer see anything, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The air thickened, the temperature dropping, and the shadows began to move. They seemed to be closing in on me, pressing me into a corner. I couldn't breathe. Panic started to claw at my chest. The room was alive, or so it seemed. Every corner, every crevice, felt as though something was hiding, waiting. I stumbled backward, trying to find the door, but it felt as though the walls were shifting, closing in around me. I couldn't see where I was going. The dark room seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows twisting and curling in unnatural ways. Then came the scream, sharp, blood-curdling, the sound ripping through the darkness like a blade. I couldn't tell where it came from. Was it the patient or something else? I had to get out. I reached for the door, my hands trembling, and when I finally found it, I rushed through the doorway and into the hallway. I didn't look back. The feeling of being pursued, of something following me, lingered long after I left that room. My breath was ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know what happened in there that night, but I know this. I will never forget the whisper, the voice that still echoes in my mind. It lingers in the silence, in the corners of my thoughts. And no matter how many times I walk through that hallway, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still waiting for me in that empty room. Sometimes, when I pass by Building 5, I swear I can hear faint footsteps echoing in the distance, a reminder that I'm not the only one who's still here. It was around 2:15 a.m. when my shift began. The hospital was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that felt almost oppressive. The security room on the ground floor was dim, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. I sat in front of the security monitors, the steady hum of the cameras filling the room as they cycled through their usual routine. Everything seemed normal, like any other night, but there was something in the air that night, something strange that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I kept glancing out the window, struggling to stay awake as the night grew darker. Then I heard a rustling sound. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned my attention back to the monitors, and that's when I saw it. On camera 5, there was movement in the long, empty corridor that ran along the back of the hospital. I knew that hallway well. It was always empty at this hour. Only a few staff members were allowed in there, and everyone knew to stay out. But there, in the dim light, a man was walking. He was dressed in all white, almost glowing against the shadows. I frowned, my mind racing. What was he doing here at this hour? The section of the hospital was closed off at night. No one should be walking around in there. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look at the man on the screen. He moved slowly, methodically, without hesitation, his footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. But there was something wrong. His footsteps were too clear, too crisp, as if they were right in front of me, echoing through the quiet room. I quickly rewound the footage, my fingers trembling slightly. As I watched, the man kept walking, turning the corner at the end of the hallway. But that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The hallway didn't end in a corner like it was supposed to. There was no door there, no exit. The wall should have been solid. I paused the footage, confused and disoriented. Why was the man walking into a wall? I rewound again, trying to make sense of it all. But this time, there was a glitch. The man disappeared, as if he had collided with the wall and vanished. I froze, staring at the screen. This didn't make sense. I knew this hospital better than anyone. I had worked here for years. Nothing like this had ever happened before. I rewound the footage once more, my heart pounding in my chest. But the same thing happened again. The man was gone, his silhouette completely erased from the screen. The strangest part, the sound of his footsteps was still there, echoing through the room. I couldn't see him, but I could hear him, clear as day. Fear crept in, settling deep in my gut. My hands shook as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I leaned back in my chair, trying to steady my breathing. I'm just imagining things, I told myself. It's just the night, the darkness playing tricks on me. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I left the security room and made my way toward that corridor. Every step I took seemed heavier than the last. The hospital, usually so quiet, felt different tonight. The air was cold, almost unnatural, and the silence was suffocating. I had worked here long enough to know when something was off, and right now, everything about this place felt wrong. As I walked down the darkened hallway, the echo of those footsteps still rang in my ears. With each step I took, the sound of them seemed to grow louder, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. My heart raced as I pressed forward, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. That man, the one in white, he was standing at the end of the corridor, facing away from me. I stopped dead in my tracks. I should have turned around, should have run back to the security room and locked myself in, but my feet were rooted to the floor, and then I saw his eyes, or rather, the lack of them. There was nothing but dark, empty voids where his eyes should have been. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The man didn't move, but somehow he was closer. His figure appeared to float toward me, his clothes glowing faintly in the dim light, but it wasn't comforting. It was terrifying. The emptiness in his eyes was like a void, sucking the warmth and light from the world around him. I stumbled backward, trying to put distance between us, but he moved forward, appearing right in front of me. The coldness around him was overwhelming, and the sound of his footsteps, once so distant, was now right beside me, filling my ears. My body froze, and in that moment, I realized this wasn't real. None of it was. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the security room, my hands gripping the desk, my heart pounding in my chest. How much time had passed? I had no idea. I just knew that I couldn't stay there any longer. The next morning, as I was preparing to leave for my shift change, the morning guard stopped me. "You know about the staff member who disappeared, right?" he asked casually. I frowned, unsure what he meant. "A guy, 3 weeks ago. He went missing at midnight. We checked the security footage, and he was in that same corridor, the one that's always closed off. No one knows what happened to him. He just vanished." My blood ran cold. The man in white. I knew exactly who he was. I didn't go back to the monitors after that, but I knew, deep in my bones, that the stranger in the corridor, wasn't just missing. He was still there, still waiting in that dark, abandoned hallway. And maybe, just maybe, he was waiting for someone else to walk down that path, forever lost in the cold, empty corridor.